The train whistle pierced through Devil's Canyon like a death scream, and Samuel Harrow knew his life was about to shatter in ways he couldn't imagine. Standing on that dusty Wyoming platform in 1882, clutching a photograph of a woman who'd lied about everything that mattered, he was about to discover that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the most devastating betrayals. What happens when a desperate rancher orders a bride through letters, only to find the woman who arrives can't walk? This is a story about two broken souls who traveled across an unforgiving frontier to find each other. And the moment when Samuel first saw Clara Brennan being lifted from that train in a wheeled chair would change everything he believed about strength, love, and what it truly means to stand tall. Before we dive into the story, I want you to be part of our growing community. Click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another incredible story of love and redemption from the American frontier. And please, leave a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing that people from all over the world are joining us for these powerful tales of the human spirit. Now, let's continue with the story. Samuel Harrow had memorized every line of Clara Brennan's photograph. 3 months of letters, promises of fresh starts, and careful descriptions of her skills had led to this moment. The Wyoming sun beat down mercilessly as passengers began stepping off the train, ladies with parasols, men with business suits, children clutching their mothers' skirts. But no Clara. His rough hands smoothed the crumpled photograph once more. Auburn hair, clever eyes, that slight smile that had made him right back to her advertisement in the first place. The platform slowly emptied, leaving only freight to unload, and Samuel's growing certainty that he'd been fooled. Then the conductor called out, not to him by name, but with words that froze his blood. They needed help with a special passenger, a woman who couldn't manage the steps. Samuel watched, transfixed, as 2 porters carefully lifted a wheeled chair from the modified cargo door. And in that chair sat a woman with auburn hair and clever eyes, gripping her own copy of his photograph like a lifeline. Their eyes met across 20 feet of platform, and Samuel saw everything in that instant. The defiance in her lifted chin, the terror barely hidden behind her rigid posture, the way her knuckles went white around his picture. This was Clara Brennan, his mail-order bride. The woman who'd written about cooking and cleaning and tending gardens. The woman who'd forgotten to mention she couldn't walk. The porters wheeled her closer, and Clara spoke first, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She could cook, she said. She could sew and keep books and do everything she'd promised in those letters. Everything except walk. The word hung between them like a challenge, and Samuel felt his carefully planned future crumbling like drought-struck soil. The wagon ride to his ranch stretched through 2 hours of Wyoming wasteland. Clara didn't cry, didn't plead, didn't explain. She memorized the landscape instead, as if cataloging escape routes or grave sites. Samuel's mind raced through options. Send her back immediately. Keep her through harvest. Honor the agreement despite the deception. His thoughts scattered when Clara finally spoke again, not about her legs, but about the innovative dry farming techniques she'd read about, methods that might save his failing ranch. When they crested the final hill and his ranch spread before them, ramshackle and struggling, Samuel heard Clara's sharp intake of breath. Not at the isolation or the obvious poverty, but at something else entirely. She saw potential where he saw failure. Her fingers traced calculations in the air, measurements and possibilities, and for the first time since lifting her from that train, Samuel wondered if maybe they'd both been lying in those letters. Maybe they were both desperate enough to build something from nothing. The house needed repairs, the fences were failing, and winter would come whether they were ready or not. But as Samuel lifted Clara from the wagon, she didn't stiffen at his touch anymore. Instead, she studied his face like she was memorizing it, the way she'd memorized the land. Neither of them knew that this moment, this first arrival at a failing ranch in Devil's Canyon, would become the beginning of a love story that would reshape the entire territory. They only knew that they were both liars, both desperate, and both too stubborn to quit before they'd even started. The first night in Samuel's house, Clara waited until his breathing deepened in the next room before she began her desperate crawl across the kitchen floor. Her dress caught on splinters, her palms bled from the rough boards, but she'd made harder journeys than this. By lamplight, she dragged herself to the stove, then to the shelves, memorizing where everything lived in this foreign kitchen. If Samuel found her collapsed here at dawn, at least he'd find her surrounded by proof that she could earn her keep. The pain in her legs was nothing compared to the fear of being sent back. Back to being a burden, back to pitying looks, back to a family that loved her but saw her as furniture to be moved and maintained. She'd rather die on this kitchen floor than return to that slow suffocation. Clara pulled herself up using the table edge and began to work. Biscuits first, using the last of his good flour. Then beans with salt pork, coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and preserved peaches she'd found hidden behind the lard. Samuel found her at dawn exactly as she'd planned, slumped at the table with breakfast laid out like a battle won. Her hands were raw, her dress torn, but her eyes blazed with triumph when he walked in. The shock on his face transformed into something else, something that looked almost like admiration, as he took in what she'd accomplished in the dark. He sat down slowly, as if sudden movements might shatter this strange moment. The coffee was perfect, the biscuits light as air, and Clara watched him eat with the intensity of someone whose life depended on this meal's reception. When he finally spoke, it wasn't about the food or her legs or the deception that hung between them like morning fog. Instead, Samuel asked how long she'd been crawling around his kitchen in the dark. When she admitted to most of the night, he stood abruptly, and Clara braced for rejection. But he returned with clean cloths and a basin of water, kneeling beside her chair to tend her bloodied hands with a gentleness that made her throat tight. Neither of them spoke while he worked, but the silence felt different now, less like judgment and more like consideration. Over that breakfast, the truth poured out of both of them like water through a broken dam. Clara told him about the fever at 17, how it had stolen her legs but sharpened her mind, how she'd spent years learning everything she could from books, becoming expert in things she'd never touch. Her sister had written the letters, yes, but every word about her skills was true. She could manage accounts, plan crops, design irrigation systems. Her body was broken, but her mind was not, and she'd rather be useful on a failing ranch than useless in a comfortable home. Samuel's confession came harder, pulled out word by word like splinters. The prosperous ranch he'd described existed only in his hopes. The last 2 harvests had failed, drought and poor planning destroying everything. The photograph he'd sent was 5 years old, before grief and failure had carved lines into his face. He'd lied about having hired hands when it was just him against the wilderness. He'd promised security he couldn't provide, comfort that didn't exist, a future he couldn't guarantee. They sat in that kitchen as the sun climbed higher, 2 frauds examining their mutual deception. Clara proposed her bargain with the same clear logic she'd used to plan breakfast, despite the pain. 6 months to prove herself useful. She'd handle the books, research new farming methods, manage the household despite her limitations. If she couldn't increase profits by spring, he could send her back with no obligation. Samuel studied her face, this woman who'd dragged herself across his floor rather than admit defeat. Something in her fierce determination called to something equally stubborn in him. He'd been fighting this land alone for so long, he'd forgotten what partnership might feel like. When he agreed to her terms, Clara's smile was sharp as winter wind, beautiful and dangerous and absolutely determined to succeed. As he helped her to the room that would be hers, their hands touched when reaching for the doorframe, and both pulled back as if burned. But the damage was done. That accidental contact echoed through the rest of the day as they carefully navigated around each other, 2 liars building something that might become truth if they could just survive long enough to see it bloom. 3 weeks had passed since Clara's arrival, and she'd developed a rhythm to her days. Samuel would lift her into her chair each morning, neither of them acknowledging how his hands lingered a moment longer than necessary, how she'd stopped stiffening at his touch. He'd leave for the fence lines, and she'd manage the house, dragging herself when needed, too proud to ask for help with modifications that would make her life easier. This particular afternoon, Samuel had been gone longer than usual. Clara was reconciling his scattered accounts when she heard the chickens erupting in panic. Through the window, she saw them, 3 wolves circling the coop with the patience of predators who knew their prey was trapped. Her blood turned to ice. Those chickens were their only reliable food source, Their only items for trade in town. Losing them would mean disaster. The rifle hung above the door. Might as well have been on the moon for someone who couldn't walk. But Clara had become an expert at impossible things. She dragged herself from her chair, using furniture and walls to pull her body across the room. The rifle was heavy when she finally reached it, heavier still as she pulled herself to the door. Her father had taught her to shoot before the fever, back when she could stand steady. After, she'd practiced from her chair, knowing that someday her life might depend on not being helpless. The porch was rough against her body as she dragged herself out, positioning herself against the railing. The wolves hadn't noticed her yet, focused on the increasingly frantic chickens. Clara's hands were steady as she sighted down the barrel. The first shot took the largest wolf clean through the heart. The second wolf turned, snarling, and she dropped it before it could charge. The third began to run. But Clara had learned that in this wilderness, mercy toward predators meant death for the innocent. Her final shot was perfect. That's how Samuel found her an hour later, still propped against the porch railing with the rifle across her lap. 3 dead wolves scattered in the yard like a statement of intent. His face went through a symphony of emotions. Fear, amazement, something that looked dangerously close to pride. Clara's hands finally began to shake as the aftermath hit her. But she kept her voice level when she explained that her father had insisted she learn, that she'd practiced every day since the fever because she'd known she'd need to protect herself somehow. Samuel didn't speak for a long moment. Then he disappeared into the barn, returning with tools and lumber. As the sun began to set, he built her a platform on the porch, modifying the space so she could defend the homestead without dragging herself across splinters. He worked with focused intensity, measuring twice, cutting once, creating something that was both practical and carefully considered. While he worked, Clara read to him from the journal she'd been keeping. Not about her struggles or her pain, but about the agricultural innovations she'd discovered in her research. Crop rotation methods that could restore the soil, water conservation techniques from California, new strains of drought-resistant wheat being tested in Kansas. Her voice grew animated as she described possibilities, and Samuel found himself stopping to listen, really listen, to this woman who saw solutions where he'd only seen problems. They worked until midnight, planning and building simultaneously. Clara sketched irrigation diagrams while Samuel hammered boards, and occasionally their ideas would collide and merge into something better than either had imagined alone. When exhaustion finally stopped them, Samuel carried her inside, and for the first time, Clara let herself relax in his arms instead of maintaining rigid control. As he set her in her chair, their faces were close enough that she could see flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could smell the sawdust and sweat of honest labor on his skin. Neither moved for a heartbeat too long. Then Samuel stepped back, bidding her good night with unusual formality. But Clara saw him glance back at her once before disappearing into his room, and she knew he'd be lying awake just as she would, thinking about partnerships and protection and the way it felt to work beside someone who understood that survival meant fighting for every small victory. The next morning, Samuel found her on her new platform with coffee and breakfast, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. She'd already dragged the wolf carcasses to the barn for skinning. Their pelts would bring good money in town. When she smiled up at him, fierce and proud and absolutely unbroken, Samuel realized he'd stopped thinking about sending her away. Somewhere between that first awful night and this morning's sunrise, Clara Brennan had become essential to his survival. And maybe, just maybe, he'd become essential to hers. Harrison Pike arrived on a Tuesday morning like a vulture descending on dying cattle. His black carriage kicked up dust that seemed to hang in the air like an omen. And Clara watched from her platform as Samuel's shoulders tensed at the sound of approaching wheels. She'd been expecting this visit since discovering the foreclosure notices hidden in Samuel's desk, dated and redated as he'd begged for extensions. Pike stepped down from his carriage with practiced authority, his suit immaculate despite the dust, his smile sharp as broken glass. His expression shifted when he saw Clara, a flash of disgust quickly masked by false concern. He climbed the porch steps slowly, eyes taking inventory of everything worth selling, including, Clara realized with cold certainty, her. The conversation started with mock pleasantries, Pike inquiring about Samuel's health, the ranch's progress, the unusual addition to the household. His eyes lingered on Clara's chair, on her legs covered by a quilt, on the rifle within her reach. When he smiled at her, it was the smile of a man calculating profit margins on human misery. Samuel's jaw clenched as Pike produced the foreclosure papers with theatrical regret. 3 months behind on payments. Crops failed. No visible means of recovery. But Pike had a solution, delivered with poisonous generosity. He'd take the ranch now, pay Samuel enough to start over somewhere else, even cover train fare to send the unfortunate woman back east where she could receive proper care. He said those last words while looking directly at Clara, as if she were livestock to be disposed of humanely. Clara had been silent until that moment, but she'd spent 3 weeks preparing for this exact confrontation. She wheeled herself forward, producing ledgers she'd been meticulously keeping. Her voice was steady as cathedral bells as she presented her case. Projected profits from the new rotation system. Expected yields from the drought-resistant seeds she'd ordered. Water rights Samuel didn't even know he owned that she'd discovered in territorial documents. Pike's laughter was ugly, dismissive, the sound of a man who'd never been challenged by someone he considered less than human. But Clara had one more card to play. She'd recognized Pike's name from her father's correspondence, knew about his speculation schemes, his phantom investors, his creative interpretation of territorial banking laws. Her father had been investigating Pike before his death, and she'd inherited more than just his keen mind. The atmosphere changed when Clara began listing specific transactions, dates, amounts that didn't match public records. Pike's face darkened from red to purple as she explained how interested the territorial governor would be in these discrepancies. Samuel stood frozen, watching his wife reveal herself as something far more dangerous than either man had imagined. Pike lunged forward, grabbing Clara's chair. Whether to threaten or topple her, neither would ever know, because Samuel's fist connected with Pike's nose before the thought could become action. The crack of breaking bone was loud as a gunshot, and Pike staggered back, blood streaming through his fingers. His threats came thick and fast then, promises of sheriffs and seizures, of making sure everyone knew what kind of crippled fraud Samuel had married. Clara's laugh cut through his tirade like winter wind. She revealed her final weapon, correspondence with Mrs. Adelaide Pike, the wife Harrison had abandoned in Denver, claiming she died of consumption. Adelaide was very much alive, managing hidden assets with Clara's help, ready to expose not just bigamy, but embezzlement that would destroy Pike entirely. The blood drained from Pike's face faster than it flowed from his nose. As Pike retreated to his carriage, he turned back with venom in his eyes, promising this wasn't over. But Clara had already begun her next move, wheels turning both literally and figuratively as she moved to her desk. She had letters to write, alliances to strengthen, a network of struggling ranchers who'd benefit from her knowledge and would stand together when Pike returned with force. Samuel stood silent through it all, watching this woman he'd thought helpless reveal herself as a general planning a war. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been awe. He asked her why she hadn't told him about Pike, about her father's investigation, about the power she wielded through information. Clara's answer was simple and devastating. She'd needed to know if he'd protect her because she was useful, or because she was his wife. Today, he'd proven it was both. That night, they didn't pretend to maintain separate spaces. Samuel sat beside Clara's chair as she wrote letter after letter, and when her hand cramped, he took over writing while she dictated. They worked until dawn, building fortifications made of paper and law, and somewhere in those long hours, partnership became something deeper, something worth fighting for. The storm arrived without warning, the kind of brutal assault that reminded humans how small they were against nature's fury. Samuel had just gotten Clara to the stable to check on his pregnant mare when the sky turned green-black and the wind began screaming like something possessed. The house roof gave way with a crack they heard even over the storm's rage, and suddenly, the stable was their whole world. Samuel's prize mare, Bethany, was in hard labor and losing strength fast. She'd been his mother's horse, the last living connection to a woman who'd taught him that gentleness and strength weren't opposites but partners. Now Bethany was dying. The foal turned wrong, and Samuel's hands shook as he realized he might lose them both. The stable walls groaned against the wind while Clara pulled herself closer to the mare's head, speaking soft Irish words her grandmother had used for laboring mothers. Clara had never delivered a foal, but she'd read every veterinary text she could find, preparing for moments exactly like this. Her voice cut through Samuel's panic with surgical precision. The foal needed turning, she explained, guiding Samuel's hands with words since she couldn't reach. She told him about the anatomy, the angles, how to work with contractions instead of against them. Hours passed in that lantern-lit stable, Clara holding Bethany's head while Samuel followed her instructions, both of them covered in sweat and hay and determination. When Samuel's strength began failing, Clara told him stories to keep him focused. About the traveling veterinarian who taught her father's stable hands, about the ancient Celtic traditions of speaking horses through birth, about her grandmother who'd saved countless animals with knowledge passed down through generations of Irish women who understood that healing was its own kind of power. Her voice never wavered, even when Bethany's breathing grew shallow, even when Samuel's frustration turned to desperation. The foal finally turned just as the storm reached its crescendo. "One more push," Clara urged, and Samuel pulled while Bethany gave everything she had left. The foal slipped free in a rush of fluid and life, tiny and perfect and breathing. Samuel's sob of relief was lost in the wind's howl as he cleared the foal's airways, watching it struggle to stand on legs as shaky as new faith. Bethany lifted her head, whickering soft welcome to her baby, and Clara's eyes met Samuel's across the mare's body. That's when Samuel broke completely. He told Clara about his mother's death, how Bethany had stood vigil at her deathbed, how the horse had been the only witness to his tears when his father and brother died in the mine. He'd kept the mare beyond wisdom or profit because losing her meant losing the last creature who'd known him before failure carved him hollow. The ranch had become a tomb of memories, and he'd started talking to the horses because silence felt like drowning. Clara pulled him against her shoulder, this man who'd been nothing but strength and distance, and let him grieve into her neck while the storm raged outside. When his breathing steadied, she shared her own darkness. Years of being invisible in her family's home, useful only for figures and mending, never touched except when being moved like furniture that happened to breathe. She'd memorized the sound of life happening in other rooms, learned to make herself smaller, quieter, less inconvenient. Coming here had been her last desperate grab at mattering to someone, somewhere, for something more than pity. They stayed in that stable through the night while the storm exhausted itself against the world. Samuel built a bed from hay bales and horse blankets, lifting Clara carefully, reverently, like she was something precious instead of broken. They lay side by side, not as husband and wife, but as two survivors who'd found each other in the wreckage of their former selves. When Samuel kissed her forehead at dawn, it was a promise and a prayer and a recognition all at once. The morning sun revealed devastation and miracles in equal measure. The house stood damaged but repairable. The other animals had survived, and Bethany's foal was nursing strongly. But more importantly, something fundamental had shifted in that stable. Clara looked at Samuel and didn't see a mark or a meal ticket or a means to escape. She saw a man who trusted her knowledge when everything was at stake, who'd broken in her arms and still held her like she was whole. Samuel gazed back at her and saw not burden or deception, but a woman who'd guided him through darkness with steady voice and steadier faith. When he carried her from the stable, she pressed her face into his chest and breathed him in, memorizing this moment when 2,000 miles of running had finally brought her home. The ranch might be breaking, the banker might be circling, but in this man's arms, Clara had found something worth every mile of railroad track, every night of crawling across floors. Every moment of proving herself worthy of the space she occupied in the world. Clara found the hidden whiskey bottles first, stashed behind grain sacks like guilty secrets. Then she found the date circled on Samuel's calendar in black ink, as if marking a death. When she discovered the old newspaper clipping about the mine collapse that killed Patrick and Thomas Harrow, everything clicked into place. Today was the anniversary. And Samuel had been drinking since before dawn. She could hear him stumbling in the barn, talking to ghosts only he could see. She wheeled herself out to find him sitting in the dirt, dynamite stolen from Pike's construction site laid out like a funeral offering. He was planning to seal the mine forever, bury the silver and the memories and maybe himself along with them. His eyes were wild with a decade of suppressed grief when he looked up at her, expecting judgment or pity or the careful distance people maintained around dangerous men. Instead, Clara asked him to show her where they died. The request cut through his drunk haze like cold water. Nobody had ever asked to see it, to witness the place where his world had ended. Clara's eyes held no morbidity, only the steady understanding of someone who knew that some wounds needed air before they could heal. Samuel laughed, bitter and broken, asking how a woman who couldn't walk expected to enter a mine shaft. Clara's response was typically practical. They had rope, pulleys, her chair could be modified. She'd been underground before. Her father had invested in coal mines and insisted on inspections. She wasn't afraid of the dark or the deep, only of watching the man she'd grown to love destroy himself with the weight of unwitnessed grief. Samuel stared at her for a long moment, this woman offering to descend into his personal hell just to stand witness to his loss. The journey to the mine was silent, except for the creak of wagon wheels. The entrance gaped like a mouth full of broken teeth, wooden supports rotting, warnings posted by the Territorial Authority fading but still legible. Samuel rigged the pulley system with hands that shook from more than whiskey, but Clara's presence steadied him. She transferred from her chair to the makeshift sling without hesitation, trusting him to lower her into the earth. The descent was terrifying and necessary in equal measure. Clara's lamp illuminated walls that sparkled with mineral deposits, the beauty and danger of the earth's hidden treasures. Samuel descended after her, and together they navigated the tunnel using ropes and determination. The cave-in site was a monument to sudden death, tons of rock that had fallen without warning, crushing dreams and bones with equal indifference. But Clara saw something else in her lamplight, something that made her breath catch. Behind the rubble, in a section the original miners had missed, a vein of silver ran through the rock like lightning frozen in stone. Not just traces, but a thick, rich deposit that could save everything if carefully extracted. She didn't speak immediately, letting Samuel tell the story of that day, how he'd been sick and stayed home, how his father and brother had gone down laughing about some joke he couldn't remember, how the mountain had taken them and left him behind to wonder why. When his words ran out, Clara pointed to the silver. Her voice was gentle but firm as she explained what she saw, the opportunity hidden in tragedy. They could extract it carefully, slowly, safely, enough to pay Pike, enough to build the ranch into something sustainable, enough to honor the dead by living fully. Samuel's first instinct was refusal. The mine was a grave, not a bank. But Clara asked him what his father would want, what his brother would say about letting Pike take everything while Silver sat useless in the dark. They developed the plan there in the lamplight, surrounded by ghosts and glittering possibility. Samuel would go down for short periods, never alone, while Clara kept watch at the entrance. She'd sing the Irish songs her grandmother taught her, old melodies about crossing water and finding home, so he'd know he wasn't alone in the dark. They'd extract just enough, no greed, no risks, just survival, mined from the mountain that had taken so much. The first descent nearly broke Samuel's nerve entirely. The dark pressed against him, like physical weight, and every sound echoed with memory. But Clara's voice drifted down the shaft, singing about green fields and rivers running home, and he forced himself to chip at the vein. Each day grew easier, not because the fear faded, but because Clara's presence above ground anchored him to the living world. She never missed a day, even when rain soaked her through, even when her own pain made sitting torture. After 3 weeks, they had enough raw silver to change everything. The night Samuel emerged with the final load, Clara was waiting with coffee and quiet pride. He kissed her then, not on the forehead, but fully, desperately, tasting tears and earth and redemption on her lips. She kissed him back with equal fervor, this man who'd faced his demons and emerged with salvation. That night, For the first time, Samuel carried Clara to his bed instead of hers, and they held each other through the darkness, no longer pretending that this arrangement was temporary or practical or anything less than love. Dr. Marcus Ashford arrived from Denver in a pristine carriage that had never seen real dirt, carrying medical bags worth more than Samuel's yearly earnings, and wearing the expression of a man doing charity work among savages. Clara's father had sent him without warning, a specialist in spinal injuries who'd supposedly developed revolutionary surgical techniques. Samuel found Clara on the porch, white-faced and rigid, staring at the letter that had accompanied the doctor like she was reading her own death warrant. The examination was humiliating in its thoroughness. Dr. Ashford spoke over Clara's head to Samuel, explaining her condition as if she were a fascinating specimen instead of a human being sitting right there. He used words like unfortunate case and limited functionality, while his hands moved her legs with clinical detachment, noting responses and making marks in his leather journal. Clara bore it all with silent dignity, but Samuel saw her hands trembling in her lap, saw the way she bit her lip when the doctor discussed her as if she couldn't understand English. The surgery he described sounded like a miracle wrapped in warnings. New techniques from Vienna, experimental procedures that had shown promise in select cases. 20% chance she'd walk again, maybe not perfectly, but functionally. 60% chance nothing would change except scarring. 20% chance she'd die on the operating table or from infection after. The doctor delivered these statistics like weather predictions, bland and unmoved by their weight. But what made Samuel's blood boil was what came next. Dr. Ashford began describing facilities back east, institutions where Clara's kind could receive proper care without burdening family members. Places with trained staff who understood the special needs of invalids, who could manage the difficulties that came with such limitations. He had brochures in his bag, testimonials from grateful families who'd found peace knowing their damaged relatives were appropriately maintained. Samuel's chair scraped against wood as he stood, violence radiating from every line of his body. His voice was deadly quiet when he told the doctor to get out, to take his institutions and his pity and his surgical promises and never darken their door again. Dr. Ashford stammered about opportunity and modern medicine, about Clara's father's wishes and generous payment. But Samuel was already moving, physically herding the man toward his fancy carriage. Clara stopped them both with a single word. She wanted to hear everything, every detail, every risk, every possibility. Her voice was steady as mountain stone as she questioned the doctor about success rates, recovery times, specific techniques. She took notes in her neat hand, treating this like any other problem to be solved through careful analysis. The doctor, clearly uncomfortable with her direct engagement, answered increasingly quickly, eager to escape this unexpected interrogation. When he finally left, dust from his carriage still hanging in the air, Clara and Samuel sat in silence that stretched like taut wire. She spoke first, explaining that her father meant well, that this was love expressed the only way he knew how, through money and experts and attempts to fix what he saw as broken. She'd already decided to refuse. Had actually decided the moment she'd read about the 20% mortality rate, but she'd needed to hear it all to close this door completely. Samuel found her that night at her desk, writing letters to her father. Multiple drafts lay crumpled nearby, each attempt to explain why she was choosing this life over the possibility of walking again. When Samuel read over her shoulder, he saw the words that stopped his heart. She wasn't broken here. She was a rancher's wife who saved chickens from wolves, delivered foals in storms, and mined silver from sorrow. She had a husband who trusted her aim and her arithmetic equally, who carried her not as burden but as partner, who'd bloodied his knuckles defending her dignity. The next morning, they rode to town together, Clara in her modified wagon seat that Samuel had built, him riding close enough that their knees brushed with each horse's step. The circuit judge was a practical man who'd seen enough frontier marriages to recognize real partnership when he witnessed it. The ceremony was brief but binding, Clara keeping her own name professionally but taking Samuel's legally, a compromise that made them both smile. Pike watched from his bank window as they signed the marriage certificate, his face purple with rage at this public declaration. He thought Clara's condition made her vulnerable, made Samuel desperate. He'd never imagined they'd choose each other so deliberately, so defiantly, so permanently. The other ranchers who'd gathered for the ceremony, men and women Clara had been helping with her knowledge, stood as witnesses and walls against whatever Pike planned next. That night, their wedding night, Samuel carried Clara over the threshold he'd widened for her chair. They made love carefully, gently, Samuel treating her body like territory to be learned rather than conquered. Clara discovered that paralysis hadn't stolen everything. That pleasure could exist in unexpected places. That being touched with intention, instead of utility, was its own kind of healing. When they lay together afterward, Samuel's hand traced the scars on her back from years of dragging herself across floors, and Clara knew she'd made the right choice. Walking was movement, but this, being held by someone who saw her as whole, this was freedom. Pike arrived at dawn with 6 hired guns, men with dead eyes and scarred hands, who made their living hurting people who couldn't fight back. They surrounded the house before Samuel could reach his rifle, and Pike strutted onto the porch like he already owned everything he surveyed. The legal pretext was thin but sufficient: mineral rights that supposedly preceded Samuel's claim, documents that might have been forged yesterday or 50 years ago. Clara sat on her platform, still in her morning dress, counting the men and their weapons with the same calm she used for calculating accounts. When Pike demanded the silver, she laughed, a sound like breaking glass that made even the hired guns shift nervously. She'd hidden it well, converted most to bank drafts already, sent certificates of authentication to Denver that proved their legal claim. Pike could tear apart the house board by board and find nothing but the satisfaction of destruction. The search was violent and thorough. They overturned furniture, ripped open mattresses, even pried up floorboards. Samuel stood rigid with barely contained rage while Clara watched with unsettling composure, occasionally mentioning the territorial penalties for destruction of property, citations flowing from her lips like poetry. When Pike's frustration reached its peak, he grabbed Clara's chair and dumped her onto the porch, saying if she couldn't tell him where the silver was, maybe pain would loosen her tongue. That's when Clara played her ace. She'd been corresponding with Mrs. Adelaide Pike for months, the abandoned wife supposedly dead from consumption. Adelaide was very much alive in Denver, managing hidden assets with Clara's careful guidance. Every transaction Pike had made thinking his wife was dead. Every document he'd signed as a widower, every penny he'd stolen from her inheritance was documented and notarized. Clara had copies, Adelaide had originals, and the federal prosecutor had been very interested in their evidence. Pike's face went from red to white as Clara outlined his crimes with surgical precision. Bigamy was just the beginning. Embezzlement, fraud, falsified death certificates, stolen property across territorial lines making it federal jurisdiction. She had dates, amounts, witness signatures from bank clerks Pike had thought too insignificant to matter. The hired guns began backing away, suddenly realizing they were accessories to federal crimes, not just territorial strong-arming. Before Pike could respond, horses appeared on the horizon. Not the sheriff Pike had bought, but other ranchers, men and women who'd been struggling until Clara had shown them how to rotate crops, conserve water, share resources. They came armed and angry, tired of Pike's stranglehold on the territory. Clara had been building this alliance letter by letter, kindness by kindness, creating a community that Pike's money couldn't buy or break. Tom Morrison spoke first, the rancher Pike had foreclosed on last year who'd rebuilt with Clara's guidance. Then Mary Sullivan, whose husband had died in debt to Pike until Clara found the payment records Pike had destroyed. One by one, they stated their grievances, their evidence, their willingness to testify in federal court. Pike was surrounded not by force, but by something far more dangerous: organized resistance backed by legal documentation. When Pike ordered his men to burn the barn, to destroy what he couldn't steal, Clara's voice cut through like a blade. She revealed that Pike's own son, estranged and bitter, had provided the final pieces of evidence about his father's crimes. The boy wanted redemption more than inheritance, and Clara had shown him how to achieve both by turning state's evidence. The barn Pike wanted to burn contained nothing but hay and horses. The real treasure was in the relationships Clara had cultivated, the network she'd built, the community she'd strengthened. Pike's retreat was neither dignified nor complete. He promised revenge, lawsuits, total destruction, but everyone present heard the hollow ring of empty threats. His men abandoned him at the property line, unwilling to risk federal charges for a man whose power was evaporating like morning dew. As his carriage disappeared, the ranchers didn't celebrate immediately. They understood this was just one victory in a longer war. That evening, the kitchen filled with neighbors sharing food and strategies. Clara sat at the head of the table, Samuel standing behind her chair, his hands resting on her shoulders in clear declaration of partnership. She outlined the next steps: legal proceedings, territorial appointments. They could influence cooperative agreements that would protect them all from future predators. These people who'd come as backup stayed as friends, seeing Clara not as the wheelchair-bound woman who'd arrived months ago, but as the tactical genius who'd saved their homes. When everyone finally left, Samuel lifted Clara from her chair and held her against him, feeling her trembling now that the danger had passed. She'd risked everything on a bluff built from careful research and strategic alliances, and it had worked. Pike was finished in this territory, and they were free to build something lasting. Samuel kissed her temple and whispered that she was magnificent, dangerous, and absolutely the best thing that had ever rolled off a train in Devil's Canyon. Clara's laugh was shaky but real as she reminded him that she'd been carried off that train. But yes, she was definitely dangerous, and she was only getting started. The wildfire started 3 miles west. Pike's final desperate revenge ignited during the dry season, when a single spark could destroy everything. Clara saw the smoke first, a black column rising against the afternoon sky like a declaration of war. By the time Samuel spotted it, the wind had shifted, driving flames directly toward their ranch with the inevitability of fate. They had maybe 2 hours before everything they'd built together became ash and memory. Samuel didn't waste time on words, just kissed Clara hard before running for the barn to release the horses. Clara wheeled herself to the porch, her mind already calculating wind speeds, fire breaks, and survival odds. She rang the bell they'd installed after Pike's raid, 3 sharp tolls that meant danger, and within minutes, riders appeared on the horizon. The community she'd built was responding, but they'd need coordination to fight this effectively. Clara became a general from her platform, directing neighbors to create fire breaks, organizing bucket brigades from the well, sending the youngest riders to warn the eastern farms. Her voice never wavered even as the smoke thickened, even as the orange glow grew visible through the haze. She kept track of every person, every animal, every essential item being saved or sacrificed. Her mind, a map of moving pieces in a deadly game. Samuel had saved most of the horses when Clara realized he hadn't returned from his last trip into the barn. The structure was already catching, flames licking at the roof beams, and Samuel was nowhere visible. The neighbors were too far away, fighting to save their own sections of the fire break. Clara didn't hesitate, didn't consider, just acted. She threw herself from her chair and began crawling toward the barn, her dress catching fire at the edges, her hands blistering on the superheated ground. The barn interior was hell-made tangible, smoke so thick she couldn't see, heat that seared her lungs with each breath. She found Samuel by sound, his groaning leading her to where a burning beam had pinned him. The wood was massive, far too heavy for a woman who couldn't even stand. But Clara had learned that impossible was just another word for necessary. She grabbed a pitchfork, using it as a lever, throwing her entire body weight against it while flames ate the walls around them. Physics and desperation worked where strength alone couldn't. The beam shifted just enough for Samuel to pull free, and together they crawled toward safety, Clara dragging him when his strength failed, Samuel pulling her when the smoke overwhelmed her. They emerged from the barn seconds before the roof collapsed, rolling away from the structure as it became a pillar of flame. Neighbors found them in the dirt, clutched together, alive but barely breathing. The fight continued through the night, but the tide had turned. The fire breaks held, the bucket brigades kept the house wet enough to survive, and by dawn, the danger had passed. The barn was gone, some outbuildings destroyed, but the house stood. The ranch survived. More importantly, The community had proven that what Clara built with knowledge and kindness was stronger than anything Pike could destroy with matches and malice. In the aftermath, as Clara treated Samuel's burns with the same gentle efficiency she'd once used on her own damaged hands, he told her about the moment under the beam. Not about pain or fear, but about clarity. He'd realized that losing the ranch meant nothing if he lost her. That every acre of land was worthless without her voice in the morning, her quick mind solving problems, her fierce spirit refusing to accept defeat. He'd been ready to die in that barn, but hearing her voice calling his name had given him reason to fight. Clara's confession came quieter. She'd spent her whole life being protected, managed, handled with care like crystal that might shatter. Crawling into that burning barn was the first time she'd been able to protect someone she loved, to use her body as a shield instead of an anchor. The fire had given her something she'd never thought possible, the chance to save instead of being saved, to be necessary in the most primal way possible. As winter approached and Clara's body changed with pregnancy she'd only recently discovered, Samuel built her something new. Not ramps or platforms for accommodation, but a workshop where she could draft the agricultural innovations she'd been designing. Other ranchers came to learn, and Clara taught them from her chair, her belly rounding with promise while her hands sketched irrigation systems that would change the territory. The fire had destroyed structures but revealed strength, and in that revelation, Clara found her purpose. The night she told Samuel about the baby, he wept into her shoulder, overwhelmed by the thought of life growing in the woman who'd crawled through fire for him. Clara held him, this man who'd built her dignity plank by plank, and knew that some choices weren't choices at all, but inevitabilities dressed as decisions. She'd chosen him the moment he'd bloodied Pike's nose defending her. He'd chosen her the moment she'd dragged herself across his kitchen floor. Everything else had just been time teaching them what they'd already known, that broken people could build unbreakable bonds if they were brave enough to crawl through fire for each other. 5 years had passed since Clara rolled off that train in Devil's Canyon, and spring of 1887 brought changes nobody could have imagined. The ranch had tripled in size, not through purchase but through partnership. Neighboring lands joined in the cooperative Clara had designed. From her specially modified wagon seat, she watched their daughter Ruby race through wildflowers on the pony Samuel had trained for her, fearless at 4 years old. Her mother's sharp mind and her father's sturdy body. Samuel knelt in the demonstration field with their son Thomas, just 2 but already fascinated by the seeds and soil. The irrigation channels his mother had designed flowing with precious water conserved through the dry months. Other ranchers' children played nearby while their parents attended Clara's weekly agricultural workshop, the barn rebuilt bigger than before, housing not just animals, but a community learning center where survival was taught through science and solidarity. The news had come last month that Harrison Pike was serving 20 years in federal prison, his empire dismantled by Clara's careful documentation and Adelaide Pike's testimony. Adelaide herself had visited last winter, arriving nervous but leaving his family, amazed at the woman who'd saved her life from half a territory away. The mine that had killed Samuel's family now employed 6 men from the community, carefully extracting silver under strict safety protocols Clara had researched and implemented. The profits shared among all the families who'd stood against Pike. Dr. Ashford arrived that afternoon, but not with promises of cures or condescension about limitations. He'd come to learn Clara's therapeutic exercises, the ones she'd developed through careful self-observation and correspondence with other paralyzed individuals. Her methods were being studied in Denver hospitals, her notes on adaptation and accommodation changing how doctors thought about disability and capability. He brought letters from dozens of people she'd helped through correspondence, people who'd found hope in her practical advice and fierce insistence that wheelchairs were tools, not prisons. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Samuel lifted Clara from her wagon to carry her inside as he had every evening for 5 years. But this time, she stopped him at the threshold, asking to try something. Using the specially designed parallel bars Samuel had built along the porch, Clara pulled herself to standing. Her legs shook, muscles awakened through years of her own designed therapies responding imperfectly but genuinely. She stood for 3 seconds, maybe 4, before her knees buckled. But Samuel caught her as he always did, as he always would. She would never walk normally, might never walk at all without support. But that wasn't the point. The point was that she'd never stopped trying, never stopped adapting, never accepted that limitations meant defeat. In Samuel's arms, being carried not from weakness but from love, Clara felt more powerful than she'd ever imagined possible when she was 17 and newly paralyzed, convinced her life was over before it had begun. After dinner, Ruby climbed into Clara's lap, asking for the story of how Mama and Papa met. Clara began the tale, how a lonely rancher expected one kind of bride but got something entirely different, how a woman who couldn't walk traveled 2,000 miles to find her strength. Samuel added his parts, how the bravest thing he'd ever seen was Clara facing down wolves from the porch, how the smartest thing he'd ever done was build her that first platform, recognizing her as protector rather than protected. Thomas fell asleep against Samuel's shoulder while Ruby fought to stay awake, demanding to know if Mama would ever run races with her. Clara's answer was honest but not sad. She couldn't run, but she could race in her wagon. She couldn't dance, but she could design. She couldn't walk the fields, but she could map them better than anyone in the territory. Different didn't mean less, and limitation had taught her to be innovative in ways that had saved not just their ranch but dozens of others. That night, Clara wrote in her journal while Samuel tended the children, then came to sit beside her, reading over her shoulder as had become their habit. She was documenting not her struggles, but her victories. The ranch that produced more per acre than any in the territory using her water conservation methods. The community cooperative that had replaced Pike's monopoly with mutual support. The children growing up knowing their mother as the woman who saved the territory's agriculture, not the woman who couldn't walk. The journal entry ended with a simple truth. She'd come to Devil's Canyon expecting to be a burden disguised as a bride, hoping at best for tolerance and shelter. Instead, she'd found a partner who saw her wheels as strength, a community that valued her mind over her mobility, and a love that didn't require fixing because it had never seen her as broken. Clara set down her pen and turned to Samuel, pulling him close in the bed they'd shared since the night in the mine, their bodies fitting together with practiced intimacy that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with acceptance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, drought or storms, market changes or mechanical failures. But tonight, Clara Harrow née Brennan lay in her husband's arms, listening to their children breathe in the next room, feeling the ranch pulse with life around them, and knew with absolute certainty that she'd traveled exactly as far as she'd needed to find exactly where she belonged. Her wheels weren't a limitation, but a declaration. She'd rolled into Devil's Canyon broken and desperate, and she'd transformed it into an empire of innovation and love, one carefully calculated risk at a time. Before we close this incredible journey, remember that the most powerful love stories aren't about perfect people finding each other, but about imperfect souls choosing to build something beautiful from whatever pieces they have. If Clara and Samuel's story touched your heart, click the like button and subscribe to our channel, because tomorrow I'll be sharing another extraordinary tale of courage and redemption from the American frontier. These aren't just stories. They're reminders that love sees past our limitations to find our limitless potential. Thank you for joining us in Devil's Canyon, and I'll see you tomorrow with another story that will restore your faith in the power of human connection.